We got a lot of questions in a lot of conferences out there. This is kind of part 2, and I don't know how many parts of series we're going to have on this, but let's just bounce around some Power 5 conferences and let's talk about big questions. Hey, here's one, I guess 2 in the SEC. Will South Carolina and or Tennessee make a bowl game? Team win totals came out the other day. Tennessee was at 6 and South Carolina was at 4. And so obviously we're trying to get to that magical 6 number to make a bowl game. You are not always what your record says you are in college. I've been doing some radio hits, and this has been sort of a popular phrase to come out of my mouth, especially when I'm talking about Carolina, but it really applies to Tennessee too. You get a new coaching staff in, and everyone wants to talk about year one, what should the expectations be? Year one, what would success look like? Well, let me ask you something. Does it really come down to a win-loss record to determine, to determine how good your program has been year one and how promising the future looks after that year one? And you may say, yeah, sports is all about wins and losses. That's really what it comes down to. I understand in any given year, yes, that's where we're keeping score. But if I'm looking at 2021 and trying to measure my expectations for 22, 23, and beyond based on this outcome, let me kick you 2 scenarios. You tell me what would be more promising. You go 6-6, but your 6 losses are all by double digits, or you go 5-7, but all 7 losses are by 1 possession. What's more promising for the future? One gets you to a bowl game. The other probably doesn't, but you give me the 5-7 with 1 possession losses all day as it relates to planning my future. So I'm trying to say all that as a frame of reference that it's not the end-all be-all to make a bowl. I'd much rather have close game losses than 6-6 with a bunch of blowouts. But having said that, I think it's a really good and I think a tangible goal, maybe a little bit further reaching for Carolina than for Tennessee, to make a bowl game in year one of these regimes. Of course, you get the extra practices, blah, blah, blah. You can sell it on the recruiting trail. So let's just fingers crossed for the Vols and the Gamecocks there. In the Big Ten, got to look at Penn State. Can James Franklin get his team to start fast? Because remember last year, it snowballed really quickly. They had some games that if you were to just look at the box scores, that Indiana game comes to mind, for example. You look at the box score and you say, how in the world did Penn State lose this game? It looks like they dominated everywhere, literally, but the final score. Unfortunately, the final score is what counts. Always has, always will. And then things snowball. So this year, how do you fix that? How do you make sure things don't snowball? Well, you never allow the snowball to be built. That's how. Then it doesn't get kicked downhill. Doubt is going to linger as long as Penn State lets it linger in 2021. And it's natural. I may have all the confidence in the world in them, but the bottom line is they got to get it done on the field to validate any of that confidence. There is doubt from 2020, and they got to completely erase it, and the only way to do that is a fast start. By mid-October, Penn State will have played at Wisconsin, versus Auburn at home, versus Indiana at home, and at Iowa. They need to win 3 of those 4. Fast start, imperative for Penn State. At Florida State, I've got some growing confidence about the Seminoles, both now and in the future. Is the transfer portal going to pay off for Florida State this year? Because I think they could potentially be set up to be one of the best stories in college football if, for example, a guy like Mackenzie Milton ends up panning out and ends up being healthy, therefore the starting quarterback in all likelihood. I mean, that could be an insane story as we watch 2021 unfold. They took 6 different transfers that we have rated in the top 100 of our transfer portal rankings. That's not the end. They took more than 6. They got 6 of them ranked in the top 100. And aside from Milton, a guy like Jermaine Johnson, for example, I look at him and I wonder, could he end up doing what Brenton Cox did? Brenton Cox left and went to Florida. I mean, is now a staple of the Florida defense. Could Jermaine Johnson be that? He immediately adds a really good pass rush presence there. Andrew Parchment comes in, is the most experienced and easily the most productive wide receiver in that room. He's a godsend for that wide receiver room. So, of course, we're not looking long-term to just build a program off the transfer portal at Florida State. I mean, I love where they're going in high school recruiting right now, but that doesn't help them in 2021. So I think that they certainly, it's easy to see the plan at Florida State. No one's looking around saying, what are we doing? Everyone gets what they're doing. Now let's see if it pays off. Is it realistic to expect Iowa State to improve this year? The best news for Iowa State is the head coach there is Matt Campbell. And when your head coach is really good at developing and evaluating, then what happens is you get every ounce of potential out of pretty much every kid on your roster, and every one of them seem to either meet or exceed expectation level you had for when they came in. But here can be the downside, which isn't really a negative. You just have to calibrate your perspective. A lot of times, once they've been on campus a couple of years, they are who they're going to be as a player. Iowa State does not have a lot of 4- and 5-star talent on their roster. Therefore, you're not going to get a bunch of superstar, future pro level production of guys spiking their junior and senior year. That's not what's going to be the norm there. Their sum is going to always be greater than what the individual parts indicate they should be. They got a lot of returning starters. It's preview magazine season. So the preview magazines are going to tell you, well, because they have this many returning starters, it just automatically means they are what? They could be exactly who they were last year. What if they just can't get any better? What if, in other words, that coaching staff is so good that they had so thoroughly developed all these guys and they so thoroughly wrung every ounce of potential out of that team that what we saw last year is the maximum capability? And by the way, it was good enough to go to the Big 12 championship game, be right there with Oklahoma, a superior roster team, in the fourth quarter, and then go to the Fiesta Bowl and beat the Pac-12 champion in Oregon. It was a great year. It was a phenomenal, historic year for Iowa State. So when I say, what if they're not capable of anything more than that? If they duplicate last year, it's incredible. What I'm saying is, I just want to be careful here, assuming that because you have X number of returning starters, it just has to mean you get better. No, it doesn't. We hope it does. Selfishly, I really hope it does for Iowa State. But I'm looking right now at what would I make the game if they were to play Oklahoma today. They don't play them till late in the year. That game's in Norman. I got Oklahoma by 8. That's what our raw numbers have. Those will adjust, but that's what our raw numbers are. So I'm just willing to see, or I'm really interested, and of course willing to see, is there something different they do? In other words, did Matt Campbell and his staff get to the end of the line last year and say, we got all these guys coming back. We see the separation. Like, we see where we are and where they are. How far do we need to go? How could we possibly accomplish that? And sometimes you don't stand pat. Sometimes you make changes. I just don't know what changes they would make. So that's going to be something to really keep an eye on. In the Pac-12, I think the Pac-12 South is going to be the most fascinating division race in college football. It may not be the absolute highest level football being played, but I think it's really going to be competitive. I think there are 4 teams in that division who I could easily see winning this thing. The problem is they don't play equal schedules. So I don't necessarily know that I can guarantee, the best team's going to win that thing. Team win totals came out the other day, as I said. Utah, over under 8.5. UCLA is at 7 for reasons I'm about to state. USC 9, Arizona State 9. If USC does not win the Pac-12 South, even I'll tell you, you got to hit the dump button. You got to clean house. The schedule comparison here, in what I think is going to be an ultra-competitive division in the Pac-12 South, so heavily tilts towards USC, it's not even funny. It's the only team out of the 4 that I believe have a shot at winning that division that does not play Oregon. They don't play Washington. Also, they get Arizona State sandwiched very nicely between 2 winnable games. Meanwhile, look across town. UCLA has the following stretch. Arizona State, then they go to Arizona, Wildcats off a bye. Then they go to Washington versus Oregon, and then what? Like, what in the world? It's not equal, is what I'm saying. And so I look at the win totals, and you say, UCLA's only 7. Well, that's because they got to play that. And by the way, they also have to play LSU at the beginning of the year. UCLA plays Utah somewhere in there too, obviously. So I look at that division, and Arizona State, they could be a really good story this year, but they could also go 7-5. There's wild variance. So that's going to be a really fun division to watch.